Okay, so you want to own a ranch. Thousands of acres of open land, cattle grazing under a big sky, a horse in the barn, maybe a creek running through the back of the property. You picture mornings on the porch with coffee, watching your own animals on your own land, and it feels less like a business and more like a life. That's the picture the listing photos are built to sell you. Here's what those photos don't show. The well pump that fails in August, the mile of fence a flood took out in April, the feed bill that lands the same week cattle prices drop, and the fact that a lot of ranch owners haven't pulled a real dollar of profit out of the place in years, even while the land underneath them keeps climbing in value on paper. Ranching may be one of the most misunderstood businesses in the country because from the outside it looks like freedom, and from the inside, the revenue shows up once or twice a year while the bills show up every single day. By the end of this video, you'll know exactly what kind of ranch actually makes money and what kind quietly drains the person who bought it. Some ranches genuinely make money year after year, decade after decade. Some ranches quietly bleed their owners dry while the land itself keeps appreciating on paper, technically making the family wealthier every year while the checking account tells a very different story. And some ranches fail outright, not because anyone stopped wanting beef, but because the numbers underneath the fantasy never worked in the first place. This video is about learning to tell which one you'd actually be buying before you sign anything. People think a ranch is a lifestyle with some livestock attached to it. In reality, a ranch is closer to two separate businesses stapled together, a real estate holding that slowly appreciates whether you touch it or not, and a commodity operation that gets paid on a schedule set by weather, biology, and a cattle futures market you don't control. Almost every financial surprise that hits a new ranch owner comes from confusing those two businesses for one. The land can be making you wealthier every year, while the operation on top of it loses money every single month, and plenty of owners don't notice the difference until the bank statement forces them to. The word ranch gets used for at least half a dozen businesses that have almost nothing in common except a fence line and a mailing address. A cattle ranch raises beef animals for sale, and it's the closest thing to the classic picture: cows on grass, calves sold once a year. A sheep ranch runs a similar calendar but sells both wool and meat, usually on tighter margins per animal and a smaller acreage requirement. A horse ranch breeds, boards, or trains horses, and it runs on an entirely different clock since a horse can take years to become sellable, and boarding income arrives monthly instead of annually. A bison ranch is a specialty protein operation most consumers never think about, commanding a real premium per pound, often 2 to 3 times the price of conventional beef at retail, but requiring fencing strong enough to hold an animal that can outrun and outweigh a horse. Typically 6-foot woven wire or heavy gauge pipe rather than standard barbed wire, which pushes fencing costs well above a cattle operations. A hunting ranch monetizes wildlife instead of livestock, selling access and trophies rather than meat on the hoof, and a single guided hunt for premium game can bring in several $1,000s for a few days of access. Income that requires almost no daily feeding cost, since the wildlife largely feeds itself, but depends entirely on habitat quality and a hunting season that, like the cattle sale, only opens for a few weeks a year. A guest ranch, sometimes called a dude ranch, sells an experience: trail rides, campfire dinners, a week of cowboy life, and its entire revenue model looks more like a boutique hotel than a farm. And at the very top sits the luxury recreational ranch, which may run almost no livestock at all and exists mostly as a very large, very private piece of real estate with a barn on it. This video focuses mainly on the cattle ranch because it's the format most people picture when they hear the word, and it's the one where the gap between the fantasy and the spreadsheet is the widest. We'll come back to the guest ranch later because comparing the two says something important about what actually keeps a ranch solvent. Start with land because it's the number that swallows everything else. U.S. farmland averaged around $4,350 an acre nationally as of 2025, but that national figure hides an enormous spread. Pasture land specifically, the kind you'd actually run cattle on, averaged closer to $1,920 an acre, and even that number splits wildly by region. In the mountain states, pasture can run under $1,000 an acre. In parts of the southeast, the same category of land sells for $5,700 an acre or more. Texas alone spans the entire range within one state, from around $1,000 to $3,000 an acre for dry West Texas rangeland up to $8,000 or more in the hill country. A workable cattle operation usually needs a minimum of a few hundred acres to make the economics function at all, which means even at the cheap end of the range, the land alone can run anywhere from a few $100,000 to well over $1 million before a single cow sets foot on it. Small entry-level ranch properties in 2026 start around $500,000. Large, high-amenity legacy ranches run past $20 million, and the difference between those two numbers has almost nothing to do with how many cattle the land can support. Once you own the dirt, the fence line is next, and it's bigger than most first-time buyers expect. Standard livestock barbed wire fencing runs about $3 to $6 per linear foot installed, which works out to somewhere between $15,000 and $32,000 per mile. A modest cattle ranch might need 10 to 20 miles of perimeter and cross fencing to actually contain and rotate a herd, which puts the total fencing bill alone somewhere between $150,000 and $640,000 depending on terrain and how much of it needs to be rebuilt rather than built fresh. Fencing isn't a one-time cost either. Flooding, fallen trees, and cattle testing weak points turn it into a recurring repair line for as long as you own the place. Then there's water, and this is the cost that catches almost nobody who hasn't run cattle before. Livestock need a reliable water source, and unless the property already has one, that means drilling a well. Agricultural wells run considerably deeper and wider than a residential well, since they need to support high-volume pumps, and per-foot drilling costs of $35 to $75 add up fast on a well that might need to go 300 to 800 feet down. A single agricultural well can cost anywhere from $40,000 to $150,000 once you include casing, pump, and power hookup. And a working ranch often needs more than one, spread across different pastures, so cattle never have to walk too far to drink. Now the cattle themselves. A weaned calf, 4 to 6 months old, typically costs $600 to $800. A bred cow, one that's already pregnant and ready to start producing calves right away, runs closer to $3,000 to $3,500 depending on breed and market conditions. A starter herd of even 50 bred cows is already $150,000 to $175,000 in livestock alone, before you've built a single corral or bought a single bale of hay. And that number moves with the cattle futures market, which means the same 50 cows that cost $150,000 this year could cost 40% more or less 2 years from now, entirely outside your control. Add working infrastructure on top of all that, corrals and handling chutes to safely sort and treat cattle, a barn or equipment shed, a house if the land doesn't already have one, and equipment, tractors, hay balers, trailers, that can easily run into 6 figures on its own, even bought used. A working tractor with a loader and bush hog attachment runs $30,000 to $80,000 used. A hay baler and rake together can add another $15,000 to $40,000, and a decent stock trailer for hauling cattle to auction or the vet runs $8,000 to $20,000. None of these are optional on an operating ranch, and none of them are one-time purchases either, since equipment on a working ranch takes a beating and typically gets replaced or rebuilt every 7 to 12 years. Stack land, fencing, water, cattle, and infrastructure together, and a modest working cattle ranch can require anywhere from $500,000 on the very low end to several $1 million before it generates a single dollar of income. And the sale price of the land itself is usually the smallest lever an owner has to pull to bring that number down, since land is priced by the market, not by what the operation on top of it can actually support. There's one place in this entire business where the numbers actually run in the owner's favor, and it's worth mentioning here because it changes the holding cost math significantly. In many states, land that's actively used for qualifying agricultural production, grazing cattle counts, gets appraised for property tax purposes based on what it produces rather than what it would sell for on the open market. In Texas, that difference can cut an annual property tax bill by 80 to 90% or more, turning an $11,000 bill on a 50-acre tract into a few $100s a year. It's the one line item in ranch ownership that rewards actually running the operation instead of just holding the land. And it's also a trap of its own. Let the qualifying agricultural use lapse, and most states will claw back several years of the tax savings at once, with interest, in what's called a rollback tax. Location works differently for a ranch than for almost any other business in this genre, because the thing that determines value isn't foot traffic or a population radius. It's water, grass, and legal access to both. Start with carrying capacity, the number of acres it takes to support one cow for a year without wrecking the pasture. In lush regions with good rainfall, that can be as little as 2 acres per cow. In dry range country in the Mountain West, it can take 25 acres or more to support the same single animal. That single number changes the entire calculation of how much land a rancher actually needs. A 100-cow herd in Kentucky might fit comfortably on 200 acres. The same 100 cows in parts of Wyoming or Nevada might require 2,500 acres or more, which is exactly why cheap-looking land in the driest states isn't automatically a bargain. You're often paying a lower price per acre for land that requires 10 times as many acres to run the same number of cattle. Then there's water rights, which in most western states are governed separately from land ownership entirely, under a doctrine called prior appropriation, meaning whoever secured rights to a water source first gets priority, regardless of who owns the land it currently flows through. A property advertised with a creek or a share of an irrigation ditch is only as valuable as the water right attached to it, and in dry years, a junior water right can mean watching water pass by a thirsty pasture because someone upstream has a more senior legal claim. Ranch brokers now describe a property's water priority as a bigger long-term driver of value than the raw acreage number, because it's the one asset that protects an operation during drought when every other input gets more expensive at the same time revenue is falling. The Federal Reserve's 10th District, which covers Colorado, Kansas, Nebraska, Oklahoma, and Wyoming, reported ranch land values jumped nearly 11% year over year in early 2026, driven almost entirely by strong cattle prices pushing demand for grazing ground to record highs. That's good news if you already own the land. It's a much harder entry point if you're buying now, because the same strong cattle prices that make ranching look profitable on paper are also the reason the land underneath it just got more expensive. Drought risk stacks unevenly across the map, which matters just as much as the price per acre. The southern plains and the southwest have moved in and out of severe, multi-year drought conditions repeatedly over the last decade, forcing herd liquidations that then take years to rebuild once rain returns, since a rancher who sells breeding cows to survive a dry year can't simply buy them back the following season without paying whatever the market has done in the meantime. The southeast and parts of the Midwest carry lower drought risk but higher land prices and property taxes to match. There is no region that offers cheap land, reliable water, and low risk all at once. Every ranch location is a trade-off between those three variables, and the trap is assuming a lower price per acre means a better deal rather than simply a different set of risks priced into the number. And here's the trap that catches buyers who cross-shop ranches like they'd shop for a house. A cheap ranch in a dry region with junior water rights and low carrying capacity can end up costing more per cow raised than an expensive ranch in a wetter region with senior water rights and high carrying capacity, because the real cost of running cattle isn't the price on the listing, it's the price divided by how many animals the land can actually support without a drought wiping out the herd. There's a decision sitting underneath almost every one of these numbers that doesn't have a clean answer: buy the land outright or lease grazing rights on someone else's. Leasing pasture land typically runs $10 to $50 an acre annually depending on quality and region, a fraction of the cost of buying, and it frees up capital that would otherwise be locked in dirt, letting a new rancher put more money into cattle, fencing, and water infrastructure instead. But a lease can be pulled at the end of its term, and every improvement made to leased land, fencing, a well, a set of corrals, stays with the property when the lease ends, not with the rancher who paid for it. Buying locks in the cost and the improvements permanently along with the appreciation, but ties up capital for decades and exposes the owner to the full swing of land values in either direction. Plenty of successful operations run on a mix of both, owning a home base with the barn and corrals and leasing additional grazing acreage during the years the herd needs to expand, precisely because neither option is right for every stage of the business. Here's the sentence that explains why so many ranches struggle even when everything looks fine from the road. Expenses arrive daily and revenue arrives once or twice a year. Cattle eat every single day, rain or shine, whether the market is up or down. In regions with a long grazing season, feed costs stay relatively contained, $200 to $300 per cow annually, where cattle can graze most of the year. In the northern plains, where operators have to feed hay for 5 or 6 months out of the year, that number climbs to $350 to $500 per cow annually, and hay itself isn't a stable input. Grass hay has run $150 to $220 a ton in recent seasons, with higher quality alfalfa running $220 to $350 a ton, and a hard winter that stretches the feeding season by even a few extra weeks can blow through a year's feed budget before spring grass comes back. Layer veterinary care, minerals, and marketing costs on top of feed, and the national average total operating cost per cow, not counting land rent, land payments, or equipment depreciation, has run somewhere around $1,000 to $1,060 per head in recent years, up nearly 30% over the previous 5 years. That's the cost of keeping one animal alive and healthy for a year. It says nothing yet about whether that animal makes you any money. There's a labor cost hiding inside almost every one of those numbers that most ranch budgets never actually itemize: the owner's own time. 100-cow operations still need someone checking water, mending fence, and monitoring cattle essentially every day of the year. Work that would cost real money if it had to be hired out, and most owner-operators simply don't pay themselves a market wage for it, which is part of why the profit left over after operating costs often understates how much actual labor went into earning it. Hire that labor out instead. A single full-time ranch hand typically runs $35,000 to $55,000 a year plus housing on larger operations, and the margin calculated earlier shrinks fast. Family-run ranches survive in large part because the family's own labor is functionally unpaid, an arrangement that works for a generation raised into the lifestyle and gets a lot harder to make work for a buyer pricing in market rate help from day one. Now, the part that catches almost everyone who hasn't lived through a ranching calendar. Most cow-calf operations sell exactly once a year, when calves are weaned in the fall and shipped to auction or a feedlot buyer. For roughly 11 months of the year, a rancher is paying every one of those daily costs: hay, vet bills, fuel, fencing repairs, with no matching revenue coming in at all. Then, in a single week or two each fall, the entire year's income arrives at once, at whatever price cattle happen to be trading for that particular week. A rancher has essentially no control over the timing of that payday, and only limited control over the price, since cattle futures move on national and even global supply, drought conditions in other states, and export demand the individual operator has no influence over. Weather is the variable that sits over all of it, and unlike almost every other business in this genre, it doesn't just add cost, it can erase the asset entirely. A drought doesn't just mean a bigger hay bill, it can force an early sale of breeding stock at a bad price just to keep from running out of feed, a decision that then takes years to reverse, since it takes roughly 2 years from breeding a heifer to selling her first weaned calf. A flood that takes out a mile of fence doesn't just cost the $15,000 to $32,000 to rebuild it, it means cattle scattered across neighboring land or a highway while the fence is down. A single hard freeze during calving season can kill newborn calves before they're ever counted as revenue. None of these events are exotic, they're the ordinary background risk of the business, and the ranches that survive aren't the ones that avoid them, they're the ones that budgeted for them happening most years. There's a structural trap sitting underneath all of this that deserves its own moment. Because ranch land has appreciated steadily, many working ranches carry a land value in the millions of dollars, while the operating business on top of that land nets very little or occasionally loses money in a given year. That combination, rising net worth on paper next to thin or negative cash flow in practice, is exactly why a family can own an asset worth 8 figures and still feel a genuine cash squeeze buying feed in February. The land is not the same asset as the operation running on it, and a buyer who evaluates a ranch purely on appreciation potential, without separately underwriting the cattle operation's actual cash flow, is buying a real estate position and calling it a business. One more risk catches almost every first-time owner off guard, because it sounds like something out of an old western rather than a modern balance sheet line. Cattle theft is a real, current, and growing problem, not folklore. Texas law enforcement recovered close to $13 million in stolen livestock in 2025 alone. A single Colorado ranch lost more than $400,000 in cattle in one incident, and thieves have taken to targeting unbranded calves specifically since they're harder to trace once they hit the auction circuit. 13 states still require formal brand inspection before cattle can legally change hands, a direct legacy of exactly this problem, and ranchers in the rest of the country are largely on their own, relying on tags, cameras, and basic vigilance. Standard farm insurance can cover theft, weather losses, and transport accidents, but most policies cap the payout per head, and virtually none of them cover the thing that actually sinks an operation financially, a cattle market that drops the same month you needed to sell. And then there's the kind of risk no spreadsheet fully prepares an owner for. In June 2026, the USDA confirmed a case of New World screwworm, a flesh-eating parasite that was declared eradicated from the United States more than 4 decades ago in a 3-week-old calf in Texas. after the parasite spread north through Mexico and forced a nationwide halt on Mexican cattle imports in 2025. The USDA estimates a serious outbreak could cost the Texas economy alone somewhere between $1 billion and $2 billion, on top of an industry already sitting on the smallest national cattle herd in 75 years and beef prices already up roughly 75% since 2020. None of that is priced into any individual rancher's spreadsheet, and that's exactly the point. A biological threat, a border policy, or a single infected animal 3 states away can move the entire economics of the business before a rancher gets any say in the matter at all. This is the number every rancher eventually has to face, and it's simpler to say out loud than most people expect, even though the reality behind it is anything but simple. Start with the calf. A weaned calf at around 550 pounds has recently sold for somewhere in the 3.55 a pound range on a state average basis, which works out to roughly $1,950 per calf at auction. Now subtract what it costs to keep that calf's mother alive for the year, since her cost is really what's being paid for when that calf sells. National average annual operating cost per cow runs close to $1,000 to $1,060, not counting land payments or equipment. Do that subtraction, calf revenue minus cow cost, and you land on profit per cow somewhere in the range of $50 to $100 a head in a below average year, and $600 to $800 a head or more in a genuinely strong year with efficient management and owned unencumbered land. That's not a typo, and it's worth saying again slowly because it's the single most important number in this entire video. The gap between the worst performing cattle operations and the best performing ones, running the exact same number of animals on the exact same kind of land, can be $600 or more per cow, purely based on management. 2 ranchers with 100 cows each can walk away from the same year with a $5,000 profit or a $70,000 profit, and the cattle themselves aren't the variable. Feed efficiency, calving percentage, how much hay gets bought instead of grown, and how tightly marketing is timed to the market all matter more than almost anything about the land itself. Walk the arithmetic through on a modest 100-cow operation. At $1,000 in annual operating cost per cow, that's $100,000 a year just to keep the herd alive, before land payments, equipment, or the owner's own labor. At an average calf price bringing in somewhere around $1,900 to $2,000 per calf, and assuming a typical calving rate where roughly 85 to 90 out of 100 cows successfully wean a calf each year, that's somewhere around $165,000 to $180,000 in gross revenue. Subtract the $100,000 in operating cost, and the operation nets somewhere around $65,000 to $80,000 before land payments and equipment financing, which on a ranch carrying a mortgage or an equipment loan can absorb most or all of what's left. This is why so many working ranches run at break-even or a thin profit even in a decent year, and why an owner without significant outside income or a fully paid-off property can spend years watching the land appreciate while the checking account barely moves. It's also why almost every serious ranching operation eventually looks for a second income stream that doesn't depend on the fall calf sale. Whether that's leasing out hunting access, running a small guest operation alongside the cattle, or simply taking off-ranch employment to smooth out the 11 months of the year when the calves aren't selling yet. Say it as a formula, the way you'd actually calculate it sitting at a kitchen table in the fall. Take your annual operating cost per cow, somewhere around $1,000 in a typical year. Multiply it by your herd size, 100 cows. And that's $100,000 you need to cover no matter what happens at auction. Now take your expected calving rate, the share of cows that actually wean a sellable calf, usually somewhere between 80 and 90 out of 100. Multiply that by the price per calf the market happens to be paying that particular week. If calves are averaging $1,900 and 90 of your 100 cows wean one, that's $171,000 in gross revenue against $100,000 in cost, a $71,000 margin before land and equipment. Drop the calving rate to 80 or the calf price to $1,600 during a soft week at the sale barn, and that same formula produces $128,000 against the same $100,000 cost, a margin of just $28,000. Nothing about the herd changed. Nothing about the land changed. 2 variables that the rancher influences only partially, biology and market timing, moved the outcome by more than 50%. There's one more number worth sitting with because it explains why land price and operating profitability have become almost disconnected from each other in the current market. Strong cattle prices in 2025 and 2026 push the value of the calves at the end of the equation higher, which is genuinely good news for a working operations cash flow. But the same strong cattle market pushed ranch land values up at the same time, in some regions by double digits in a single year, which means a rancher buying in today is paying a land premium built on the same strong prices that are supposed to make the operation profitable. The math only works if those cattle prices hold for long enough to justify the land price paid to get into the business in the first place. And cattle markets, historically, do not hold steady for long. Here's what all of this looks like once real debt gets involved. And the story belongs to one of the largest cattle operations in the country, which makes it more instructive, not less. Millenkamp Cattle started in 1996 with 40 acres in Jerome, Idaho, a handful of calves, and a small operating line of credit. Over roughly 3 decades, the family built it into one of Idaho's largest cattle and dairy operations, with a calf ranch spanning several hundred acres housing approximately 50,000 calves at a time. By any visible measure, it was a success story, the kind of scaling every small operation dreams about. In April 2024, Millenkamp Cattle filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, citing financial strain from a major expansion project combined with disputes among its lenders. The numbers behind the filing were enormous for an agricultural operation. Estimated liabilities between $500 million and $1 billion, and creditors numbering between 200 and 300. The debt breakdown showed just how leveraged the expansion had become. MetLife held more than $180 million across multiple loans secured by farmland and facilities. Rabo AgriFinance held another $96 million in outstanding credit. Conterra Capital held close to $19 million in secured loans. And unsecured trade debt, money owed to feed suppliers, veterinarians, and other operators, added almost $28 million more on top of that. To keep operating through the reorganization, Millenkamp secured a $45 million debtor-in-possession loan from a specialty lender, and as part of the restructuring plan, the company moved to sell off key properties, including one parcel appraised at $16 million and another at $4.5 million, with the proceeds going straight toward debt repayment. Under the eventual plan, most unsecured claims were set to be repaid in full. MetLife would receive interest-only payments on its $184 million claim for 2.5 years, and Rabo AgriFinance would see its default interest and fees forgiven in exchange for a fully repaid $91 million claim. Nobody stopped raising cattle. The calves kept being born, weaned, and sold. The land, the actual asset the operation sat on, likely never stopped appreciating in value the entire time the company was in bankruptcy court. The failure here wasn't the cattle business itself, and it wasn't the land. It was leverage layered onto a rapid, capital-intensive expansion in an industry where revenue arrives on a seasonal schedule the lender's repayment terms don't naturally match. A cattle operation that grows by taking on debt is betting that calf prices and interest rates both stay favorable for years at a stretch, and when either one moves against the operation at the wrong moment, the same scale that made the business impressive on paper becomes the thing that makes the debt impossible to service. This is also structurally why farm and ranch bankruptcies have been climbing. U.S. courts recorded 315 Chapter 12 family farm bankruptcies in 2025, up 46% from the year before, the second consecutive year of increases. Chapter 12 exists specifically because farm and ranch operations don't fit neatly into standard personal or corporate bankruptcy timelines. Their income doesn't arrive monthly, it arrives seasonally, and a repayment plan built around a once-a-year calf check needs room to breathe that most debt structures don't naturally allow. Contrast that with what the guest ranch side of this industry looks like, because it's a genuinely different bet on the same underlying land. A guest or dude ranch sells weeks, not calves. Roughly 300 to 350 operating dude ranches exist across the country, concentrated in Wyoming, Colorado, Montana, Arizona, and Texas, and the entire sector generates an estimated $300 to $400 million a year in direct spending. A typical week-long stay runs anywhere from $1,500 at a modest working ranch up to $6,000 or more per person at a luxury property, all-inclusive, meals and horseback riding built into the price. A mid-size operation hosting 40 to 60 guests at a time at an average weekly rate in the $2,500 to $3,500 range can generate real, predictable revenue through an entire summer season instead of waiting for one autumn sale. But the guest ranch trades one kind of risk for another, weather. Most operate only 3 to 6 months a year, since the tourist season and the best weather for trail riding rarely extend much further than that, which means an entire year's staff, marketing, and maintenance costs have to be covered by a compressed operating window. Staffing runs high relative to revenue, since guest ranches typically maintain a 1-to-3 or 1-to-4 staff-to-guest ratio to deliver the personalized experience guests are paying for. And unlike a cattle operations calf check, guest ranch income depends entirely on discretionary vacation spending, which is one of the very first things households cut when the broader economy softens. During past economic downturns, some guest ranches have reported running at 60 to 70% of capacity through what should have been their peak season, with almost no ability to cut costs proportionally, since the horses, the staff, and the property still have to be maintained whether the cabins are full or empty. Put the two side by side and the contrast is almost exact. The cattle operations risk is concentrated into a handful of weeks a year at auction, driven by biology and a commodity market. The guest ranch's risk is spread across an entire tourist season, but tied to discretionary consumer spending that can evaporate the moment a recession headline runs. Millenkamp scaled the cattle side aggressively with debt and got caught by the mismatch between expansion financing and seasonal revenue. A guest ranch that overbuilds cabins ahead of demand runs the exact same risk in a different costume. Fixed costs sized for a season that doesn't show up. Neither model is inherently safer. Both fail the same way. Growth financed faster than the underlying revenue calendar can actually support it. Zoom out from any single operation and the same pattern shows up at the industry level. Chapter 12. Farm and ranch bankruptcies climbed for 2 straight years through 2025, concentrated most heavily in the Midwest and Southeast, regions carrying some of the steepest input cost increases relative to commodity prices. None of those filings made national headlines the way a billion-dollar tech company's collapse would. Agricultural distress rarely does, partly because it happens gradually, one bad calving season and one soft market at a time, rather than in a single dramatic event, which is exactly why it catches so many owners off guard. The land under a struggling operation almost never loses value at the same pace the operation itself is losing money. So the warning signs show up in a bank statement long before they show up in a property appraisal. Put a full year on a 100-cow cattle operation, starting with the version where everything goes according to plan. In the optimistic scenario, the ranch sits on land with strong water rights and good carrying capacity, so feed costs stay on the lower end, around $800 to $900 per cow annually, including a manageable hay season. Calving rates come in high, 90 calves weaned for every 100 cows, and the calf market holds at strong 2025 to 2026 levels, with weaned calves averaging close to $2,000 each. Gross revenue lands around $180,000. Operating costs run close to $85,000. That leaves roughly $95,000 before land payments and equipment financing, a genuinely solid return for a family-run operation, especially if the land itself is already paid off or was inherited rather than financed at current prices. In the realistic scenario, 2 or 3 ordinary things go wrong at once. Nothing catastrophic, just the normal friction of the business. A dry summer stretches the hay feeding season by 6 extra weeks, pushing feed costs per cow up toward $1,100. A cold, wet spring during calving knocks the weaning rate down to 80 calves per 100 cows instead of 90, and calf prices soften 10 to 15% off their highs by the time the fall sale actually happens, since the rancher has no ability to control the exact week prices peak. Gross revenue on 80 calves at a lower average price lands closer to $140,000. Operating costs, pushed up by the longer feeding season, land closer to $110,000. What's left before land and equipment costs is somewhere around $30,000. On the exact same 100 cows, the exact same acreage, and the exact same amount of daily work. That's the gap this entire business runs on, somewhere between $95,000 and $30,000 on a modest 100-cow operation, and neither outcome required a flood, a bankruptcy, or a single dramatic event. It required a slightly worse spring, a slightly longer hay season, and a slightly softer cattle market. 3 ordinary variables stacking on top of each other the way they do in most years to some degree. Weigh those outcomes against what it actually took to get there, and the picture gets more complicated than a simple profit number suggests. A 100-cow operation sitting on land worth $1 million to $2 million, plus cattle, fencing, and equipment worth another $300,000 to $500,000, is generating an operating profit in the realistic case of $30,000 $30,000 a year, a return of well under 2% on the capital tied up in the operation, before counting the land's own appreciation separately. Add typical land appreciation of 4 to 6% a year on top of that, and the total return looks much healthier on paper. But that appreciation doesn't pay the February hay bill. It only becomes real money the day the land actually sells, which for most multi-generational ranches is a day the family is actively trying to avoid. Run the same exercise on the guest ranch side for comparison. In an optimistic season, a 40-guest capacity ranch fills close to 90% of its available weeks across a 5-month season at an average rate of $3,000 per person, generating gross revenue well past $1 million, against staffing and operating costs that typically run 60 to 70% of revenue in a well-managed operation, leaving a healthy 6-figure profit for the season. In a realistic season, a softer economy or a bad wildfire smoke summer knocks occupancy down to 65%, the same story that hit dude ranches during past downturns, while fixed staffing and horse care costs barely move, since the horses still eat and the wranglers are still on payroll whether the cabins are full. That gap alone can be the difference between a genuinely profitable summer and one that barely breaks even. And unlike the cattle side, there's no fall calf check waiting to make up the difference if the season falls short. So this was never really a story about cows or horses or a piece of land with a view. It was a story about the gap between an asset that appreciates on paper every single year and an operation on top of it that has to survive on whatever the weather, the market, and the calendar decide to hand it once or twice a year without much say in the matter. None of the formats in this video are doomed, and none of them are guaranteed. A cattle ranch with strong water rights and disciplined management can run for generations. A guest ranch with the right location and a loyal customer base can turn a compressed season into a genuinely profitable business. What separates the ranch that survives from the one that quietly bleeds its owner dry was never the number of acres on the deed. It's whether the operation on top of that land was ever underwritten as a business, with its own cash flow, its own break-even math, and its own plan for the years the weather doesn't cooperate, instead of being treated as an afterthought to a real estate purchase that happened to come with a barn. The families who make this work for generations tend to describe it the same way, whether they're running 100 cows or 1,000. The land will always be there, appreciating quietly whether anyone's paying attention or not. But the operation on top of it has to earn its keep every single year, on its own terms, or it eventually becomes a very expensive hobby wearing the costume of a business. If you were putting your own money into a piece of this industry, which side would you actually want to own? The cattle or the land under a lease to someone else running them? Tell me in the comments. If this laid out numbers you'd never actually seen broken down before, a like helps more than you'd think. And if you want the same breakdown for another business people think they understand, subscribe. Every week, one more business that looks simpler from the outside than it actually is.